Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. Okay, my guest today is Jamie Bristow. Jamie is a writer and policy expert working at the intersection of inner and outer transformation and sustainability. For 8 years, he was director of the Mindfulness Initiative and clerk to the UK's all-party Parliamentary group on mindfulness. In 2023, he joined the Inner Development Goals team to lead on public narrative and policy development. And he's here to talk to us today about a middle way response and cultivating resilience with regard to the climate breakdown crisis. Hello, Jamie. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hey, good morning, Barry, and everyone. Really nice to be here.
Okay, Jamie, could you begin perhaps by telling us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in this field of work and interest?
Yeah, thank you. I started off my career in advertising and marketing, working for some of the world's biggest brands, and really saw no problem with that in that, and had an ambition to run an advertising agency and continue making commercials for the likes of Nissan. You know, I spent 18 months making adverts for SUVs driving across the tundra, making them look sexy and cool. And then I had a bit of a road to Damascus moment where I bought a book by George Monbiot called Heat, and that really changed the direction of my life. But the reason I picked up that book was because I started to I had started to really take meditation seriously, mindfulness, and that kind of made me want to, as we say in mindfulness training, like move towards the difficult rather than sort of shying away from it and resisting that information. And so that ultimately led me to leave my full-time position, at least, in that industry and work for a climate change campaign. And it was during that time that I realized that this missing piece, that this inner shift that I had over a number of years that culminated in me reading a book which changed my trajectory, was an inner shift that people weren't really considering as an important part of the picture for how we were going to navigate through this predicament. And that set me off on a kind of 15-year inquiry, really, that's got us to this point, where I've made inner outer transformations, as some people call it, or inner shifts for sustainability, a personal and professional inquiry. And that led me initially to work for Headspace, the meditation digital meditation app. And then through that got involved in this new initiative in the British Parliament, where politicians had been practicing mindfulness on a cross-party basis and started to become interested in how this could be applied more widely in the world, like how their personal insights could translate into public policy. And I was one of the volunteers and experts that came together to help them think about that. And that's really where my professional life really took on that initial insight, and I started having the great privilege to be researching and creating policy reports about some of these big, tricky problems and the missing inner dimension that a lot of our analysis and problem solutions have. Yeah. Okay,
brilliant. Okay, well, you first came to my attention, Jamie, through an article you wrote quite recently entitled Between Optimism and Despair, The Messy Middle Paths Through Climate Breakdown. Could you tell us something about that, please?
Yeah, so this piece was a kind of synthesis of common narratives that we've been immersed in working in the climate world for yeah, like over 10 years. And they are kind of at loggerheads a lot of the time. There's a camp which says we need to stay optimistic and positive and have a message of sort of hope and can-doism, because the evidence shows that if we really say how it is, people get depressed, disengaged, defense mechanisms trigger. And also we have a lot invested in it being okay. We have our sort of personal defense mechanisms as well, not just thinking about others, which means we're heavily invested in it being okay, and what we've been working on so far being sufficient. And then there's another camp which says, no, we need to tell everybody how it is, because without that more accurate assessment potentially of seeing the mess we're in, we're not going to have appetite for deep enough change in the world. And this is a kind of a straw manning here of sort of both these positions. Like, doomers have been guilty of sort of cherry picking or exaggerating the evidence as much as people who are trying to paint a rosy sort of green growth picture.
Yeah.
And very few people's take is as black and white as that. Most people think they have an accurate sense, or that they are realistic in some measure, but realize the value of hope. It's just like, what exactly do we hope for is different in different cases,
Yeah.
etc. So on the individual level, like, it's more nuanced, but how this often shows up in the world are two countervailing frames or stories that people get quite confused by, and tend to sort of adhere to the one that makes them feel most safe, or as close to what they already think. Now, there is a genuine problem with the doomerism narrative, is that people can switch to, it's so bad that I'm not gonna do anything, and on the other side, it's like, I'm getting the message that basically we've got this, that the innovation and these technologies that are coming through are going to deliver the change that we need. But our piece essentially says that this is trapping us in two different stories. Either we'll be just in time, okay, and we just need to double down on transition of energy, green energy provision, etc., which is just such a tiny part of the overall picture in itself, way more complicated than often politicians paint it. Or it's like hothouse Earth and the end of the world. And we struggle to imagine futures. But these are two that we can grapple with. Either it's largely going to continue how it is now and it's going to get a little bit tougher, but basically be okay, or it's Armageddon. Like our mind can go to those. But actually, talking about the middle way, that there are so many middle ways between these two poles, right? And that kind of that messiness and relative tragedy of the likely scenarios that we're going to have to go through. Like, we point to in this piece, the possibility of a brighter future probably predicated on a deep shift in mindsets. And this is where a lot of sustainability thinking is going now, as we start to see, oh my God, this predicament, which isn't just technological and material and physical, it's also political and psychological and cultural. And there are so many sort of entrenched habits individually and collectively. Like the predicament is so vastly complex that it's not a case of simply rewiring our grid. But we need to address some deep mindsets that particularly see the world as, or see ourselves as separate from from nature, see ourselves as separate from each other and the other side of the world. We can create harm and be oblivious to it. We're sort of blind to the impact of our lifestyles, and in important ways sort of disconnected from ourselves as well, separated from emotions, bodies, deeper values. We have become estranged from some of our the better bits potentially of our humanity, as we have a culture which inculcates extrinsic values, materialistic values, for instance, estranging us from our actually more commonly held deeper and intrinsic values of like community and love and family, health, etc., nature. Anyway, so the deep mindset shift that we want to bring about, we need to bring about for an ecological civilization, for long-term sustainability and regeneration, is possible at an individual and group level. But the more time goes on, I think people working in the space are starting to see that, well, maybe that kind of shift isn't possible without the kind of disjuncture and pain and partial collapse, or rather than collapse, it's a loaded word and it can mean different things. Might say systems failure. We are kind of undeniably going to experience some failure of systems as locally, regionally, potentially globally, and the kind of disruption to our normal lives. COVID probably will have nothing on this. In terms of the changes that will suddenly, or maybe incrementally, but anyway, we will live within, will make us see things very differently, and so that deep shift that can occur, like it did through COVID, and our worldview, in many ways, changed radically in just a few months, could precipitate a worldview, a culture, a mindset. Yeah. That is more in line with reality and therefore could set us up on better terms. So this is just one example of how things could get really tough and it's not just fine or complete collapse, but get really tough and then lead to the kind of deep changes that could lead to a better future.
So you were saying that you use COVID as an example. When the threat is sufficiently tangible, we can really work together very effectively. Perhaps another example is both the First and Second World Wars. We turned our economies around in 6 months onto a war footing because the threat was really, really tangible. But at the moment, an iceberg the size of Wales can fall off in the Arctic. Yeah. But it doesn't get on the news, whereas some, footballer having an affair does, or something like that. Is that what you're saying? That it's got to, we really have to really experience the threat for us.
Unfortunately, it might be the case. I really hope it isn't. I hope, that our collective sense making, politics, science, cultural discernment, in the media, etc., the public sphere, is enough for us to take this, take heed before. I mean, and let's not say before, because many parts of the world, including in places like the US and the UK, Northern Europe, places that until recently thought of themselves as a long way away from climate change, are feeling this now. If you speak to people in North Carolina and experiencing this once in a 1,000-year storm that happened recently, and every time we have this conversation, there's a different tragedy or disaster to talk about, and that's just the most recent one. And so it is here, and it's a question of like how much weird weather, disastrous weather, how much flight of insurance companies from whole regions of our society does it take for public discourse, financial markets, etc., to take heed? So it's a little bit like we're Wile E. Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoons. We run off the cliff, and it's like, at what point do we look down? And it's some of the people that we work with, in financial markets, and particularly in insurance and risk, seem to been making that look down. I guess you could really.
So you've started to sense that.
Yeah, and it's likely that human systems will have tipping points and kind of collapse points. and conflict and that kind of thing. Major wars are likely to bring these things home sooner potentially than sea level rise, or the kind of like the increasing regularity and fierceness of storms that actually render life very, very different. Like it'll be a mix of the two, but actually human systems might be more precarious than the physical ones.
Yeah, I
Um,
suppose the concerning thing for me, or for a lot of people, is what we're also observing as things, are quite clearly starting to become more unstable politically. You're seeing a rise in autocracy around the world. There seems to be a pattern in human history that when things get tough, we often look to, people that give easy answers to complex questions, and we tend to reflect less, and be in a more of a sort of confirmation bias loop. So that sort of yeah, it's how do you get, maybe the question of resilience comes in here. I don't know where, because the other thing, I was talking with my partner. My partner read your article last night, and she was saying, yeah, I can really recognize these two polarities, the optimist and the realist. She said, but a lot of people are stuck in the middle, either in denial, um, um, or just don't care at the moment. They don't really rein in anything realistically in their lifestyles. They're not. I don't, so again, I suppose.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah. There's another fellow talking in these similar ways. Jem Bendell, I think, puts it in like four categories. Something like there's it's not happening, or it's not as bad as we think it is, and when people are overacting. Broadly, other people have got this. They're gonna fix it. Um, uh, Never say that there's a list with a certain number of items unless you can remember all of them in advance. But one of them is I'm just too busy, and I have to say, like I'm of an age where most of my friends have kids under 10.
Yeah,
And they've asked us, my wife and I, who work on this as writers, working with the Climate Majority Project and Club of Rome and various other bodies that think about this. It's our job to think about this, and they've asked us for briefing papers to help to keep them in the loop. But even though we've done this work, a bespoke briefing paper for our friends, and then we've organised a time to speak about it with them, the reaction is still, I haven't got time for this. Like I'm busy with other things, and there's just like it feels like there is a bit of a of an age gap between young activists and potentially people who come back online with it later in their lives, because there's a particular pinch point, people in midlife who have some of the greatest power and influence, etc. But they're just they've got so much on. It's difficult to think about it, and that's even before you get to people who are just struggling to make ends meet, etc.
that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, because that's a sizable portion of the population of the world. A lot, I wouldn't say they're thinking about survival, but yeah, they're certainly thinking about their main priority is just getting to the end of the month.
Yeah.
And there's less space for them to actually take this in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back on what you were saying about, something around like polarization, disinformation. Like there are ways in which when things get worse, it will get even harder to act. Our agency will be undermined in important ways. It's not like things will get worse and we'll suddenly have a shift in mindsets and we'll be able to just act on this and everything will be fine. It's like things will get worse and worse, and in some ways better and better, faster and faster as things accelerate. And there are some places, there are some groups of people who will respond, very badly, and there will be a high probability of authoritarian capture, as people, as you say, like want kind of certainty and they want security, and there's always a strong man waiting in the wings to try and offer that. And so there will be, I think, a very different political landscape where the kind of status quo managerialism that you're seeing in even, well, I mean, in the UK at the moment, and to some extent, even though the Biden administration has been doing some good stuff, it is still within certain bounds and completely insufficient to the problem that we're facing.
Yeah.
That we're going to have much more extreme proposals. We're going to need to have some, and have a very different rhetoric, and have a very different way of speaking in order to counter the authoritarianism that's going to come in not long. And by that I mean like a politics of radical love. I mean a politics of a genuine vision that will enable, that will give people cause for some hope. But I digress. But that's just to say, these messy middle paths are messy and tragic for a good proportion of the world.
Yeah.
But that if we manage to thread the needle of that kind of civilizational bottleneck that's going to transpire, it could, by the end of the century, actually be on a pretty good path.
Yeah.
Now, it reminds me of Ralph Nader, the Green politician who ran for the presidency at the end of the 20th century in the late 90s. And he was asked, are you optimistic for the 21st century? And he said, no, but I'm very optimistic for the 22nd. And I suppose that this piece is kind of saying something similar, and putting the flesh on the bones of how we might start to think about that. And we particularly propose a model. We have a graph in this piece, which has our trajectories as we're sort of fed them in the media, which is things are going to get tough, but basically we're going to do it. It's just like it's not the last minute, but we're going to get there. And hothouse Earth, and then we have on the y-axis we have kind of complexity and social order. So down is bad, for our ability to act and support well-being and complex systems, etc. Complex life and welfare and stuff. But that these middle paths could go through kind of collapsed territory and rebound, or kind of find a new dystopian equilibrium. Now, the reason for sort of fleshing it out like that was to propose different points in this journey that different sorts of activity make sense, which I think is where you wanted to get sort of.
Yeah. Well, this is what, excuse me, I found so inspiring about your piece. So both complacency and despair are very unhelpful, but what's useful from taking from those, the extremes, was that, the importance of optimism and acceptance. Optimism is paramount, but the hope has to be within the bounds of what is the reality now, and it's sort of combining, so taking those two, and I found that really helpful for me as well. You said we mustn't discount there's going to be lots of suffering to come, but we're duty bound to be open to the idea that something post-traumatic and positive might come out of that, and that was a very hopeful message for me.
I work now looking at all aspects of what you might say the missing inner dimension of systems transformation and sustainability. So mindsets as well as inner capacities and trauma healing and that kind of thing. I spent the best part of 10 years particularly looking at the role of mindfulness and compassion as natural human capacities and things that we can train in. And mindfulness still has almost an order of magnitude more evidence than many of the other or any of the other sort of inner development approaches. So it's about 10 times more than compassion, and that's the next behind. Then you have like nonviolent communication and some other things that we can do to make ourselves more equal to these times. And one of the core principles of mindfulness, which isn't just like a well-being approach, it is a way of being in the world. It's a capacity that helps us particularly to be sensitive to novel information and to allow things to be as they currently are, to have acceptance And we can't act skillfully in the world if we haven't got accurate information about what is going on out there,
Yeah,
about who
absolutely.
we are, who others are, what the situation is, etc. But there's tons of psychological research showing that we're very bad at that.
Yeah, yeah,
We have confirmation biases coming out of our ears, and um, that's particularly true when we have like the threat of death and loss, and it's by no means a given that that those who are making decisions on our behalf and those whose sense making we tend to collectively trust have done the kind of inner work that is required to actually accept where we are right now. Like it entails grief. It entails actually a certain degree of self-awareness and psychological literacy and deployment of the kind of approaches that you need to really see in a clear-eyed way. And our
absolutely.
leaders are so pressed, they're so busy, their well-being on the whole is so poor. I'm talking about politicians here
Yeah,
particularly, but obviously there are lots of types of leaders, that they haven't got the space to do that kind of processing.
yeah,
And so they will be, because of that pressure and because of these psychological tendencies, these biases and defense mechanisms that we now know quite a lot about, um, their sense making will be riddled
yeah,
with
absolutely.
inconsistencies and blind spots, etc. So yes, we need realism, we need acceptance, and that needs to be a collective discourse, a collective process. We can't just leave people to it on their own. And we also can't therefore like be doomers and just hit people with the tough information without having some sense of what we might trigger in people,
Yeah,
which is like the ostrich effect of sticking your head in the ground,
absolutely.
or various forms of like oscillating breakdown and
Yeah,
then sort of like being too busy to think about it, etc.
yeah,
And there's a discourse between these two groups with these two narratives about the role of hope, particularly whether hope or optimism is a better word, whether there are different shades of hope. And this has been, part of the pioneering work of Joanna Macy, who has just been, like a generation ahead of most people thinking
yeah,
about, the inner dimensions of sustainability and systems transformation. And she talks about, active hope, and hope is something that you cultivate as a disposition rather than as a prediction of a particular outcome. And you have an ethics that comes out of that, which isn't so attached to particular outcomes or projections
yeah,
of how things are going to be. And that's definitely where I am. I'm you know I have these possible futures like in a superposition, like in a stack. There isn't one. You can't push me and say how is it definitely going to happen, like all um unfold. A lot of those possibilities in that stack are devastating.
yeah,
But I have cultivated, in line with what Joanna sort of pointed towards, I think a kind of a collapse accepting hopefulness, attitude of heart and spirit,
yeah,
of hope. Despite my day job basically is like staring the abyss in the face,
yeah.
um, and uh, and that I think is that I think is possible at a cultural level.
Do you think a big part of that is because you are actually acting out hope as a verb? You are because something your colleague Rupert Reed said to me that really struck home. He says you can always make things less bad, and I think that
Yeah.
really I found it extremely helpful for me. I mean, apart from you were talking about grieving, for me, part of me staying hopeful is actually at times grieving about it. Because when I'm grieving, I'm not in denial about it. I'm a Samaritan as well, Jamie.
Mm.
And sometimes people ask me, "Do you ever get depressed being a Samaritan?" I said, "No. Sometimes I feel really, really sad, but I
Mm.
sort of don't mind being sad. I'm sort
Mm.
of connected with what's going on inside here, And
Yes.
there's a similar thing for me with the there's a similar feeling like that with which I have with the climate crisis. I feel very sad, especially about biodiversity loss, and
Yeah.
you know, and but it's that's getting in touch with how I'm feeling is enables me to be open and then remain hopeful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's lovely to hear that. My father was a Samaritan as well, and speaks of it as a really important thing
Yeah,
in his life. And in mine, I really resonate with that sense that sadness can be poignant and soulful, and even sort of like cherished as part of that tapestry of human experience. You know,
yeah, yeah,
and I love that poem about how you cannot know kindness as the deepest thing unless you know sorrow as the next deepest thing.
yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, yeah,
And I think there we're very bad at grief. We're very bad at death. And when I say we, I'm of course talking about weird countries, you know, Western
yeah,
educated, industrial, etc. Um, and we are, yeah, bad at death, bad at grief, and don't, on the whole, see it as something that if you don't process and go through, it just stays with you in the background, in your body, like like
yeah, yeah,
your body keeping the score. But if you turn towards it and process it, it can on the other side be something that makes your life richer and more soulful, and then the suffering is gone. Um, well, I don't want to say that because it's much more complex than that, and I don't want to speak to other people's grief. But I have felt that um, grieving, whether it be personal or this more planetary,
yeah,
um, is is something that bears turning towards and become and can as you're pointing to, paradoxically become enriching in some strange way.
yeah. Well,
Um,
that sort of segues into another big area of your work, Jamie, which is resilience, and if you could characterize resilience in a way is sort of how you deal with difficulty in many respects, and maybe to some extent accepting that difficulty is just an everyday part of life. But
mm,
um, but you um, but you particularly at the moment focusing on resilience with regard to on a more macro level, it's societal resilience and how we can respond to these looming polycrises,
mm.
if you like. Um, would you like to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I liked what you said. You know, harking back to the conversation with Rupert Reed about you can always make things less bad, and the that's absolutely true. I was in a bar on Friday night with an old friend I hadn't seen in a little while, and we're talking about this, the state of the world and whether it's um, how inevitable that is and how much we should bother trying to fix things or whatever. And I said to him, like, we have we have no idea how much we have benefited from the people in countless generations before us trying to make things less bad. Like they it might not have created the total utopia they hoped for, but in just countless small and many big ways, we are indebted to the
Yeah,
efforts
that's
of people who have genuinely reformed things or resisted things or had those sort of small wins. And it can seem like just we're powerless,
yeah,
and the power is over there with a few people.
yeah,
This kind of new and a way of looking at it that's kind of almost Newtonian in its paradigm, because like there are discrete objects out there that have the power, and there's here us that don't have the power, and we just have to get our hands on those levers and pull them, and then suddenly something's going to happen. But those who have got the levers, they're not pulling them because they're idiots or they're bad people or
yeah,
whatever. But if you speak to politicians, as I have, and I've sat with, one particular very senior politician who's a household name, just saying like, I felt powerless. I wanted to get into these positions, and then I felt like as hamstrung as I ever was. And some people have said like the more senior you get. In fact, I was speaking to a business leader the other day. He was saying that I wanted to get promoted in order to be able to change things. And the more I got promoted, actually, the less power I felt I had, because I had to worry about all of these vested interests and all these different like power relations, and again, actually, the smaller I felt, and so we have to abandon this idea of like power being just wielded by some fixed entities that are these leviathans or these colossus entities in our landscape, and think more in terms of quantum social change. I don't know whether you come across this concept.
No.
But this is not to say that change happens quantumly because quantum is more real than Newtonianism, although maybe. It's more like the way in which we think about ourselves, human beings, politics, the world, is often conditioned by some primary stories. And we've had this primary story of a kind of like scientism grounded in a Newtonian, external world for centuries now. And that really stops us understanding how power is so much more diffuse. And actually, it's more of a quantum field where everything's interacting with everything else. And when you talk about those terms, it helps both with our sense of agency and with our resilience. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's sort of linking back to what you were saying, some of the threads of what we said before. And it also helps us think about how we might think about our own sense of agency in this unfolding middle way between it's fine and it's total disaster, where our democratic institutions might not be functioning well, they might get worse, whereas our army or our police or whatever might also be degraded. But like change is everywhere. Every interaction makes an impact, like ripples going on forever on a pond. Like they never. The impact of that particular stone dropping in the water will never completely disappear. It'll be indiscernible, but it's in the field somewhere, kind of chaos theory type stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's to say, we all have everything to play for together in the field. And this article points towards 3 fields of action. So using this sort of field theory sort of terminology.
Yeah.
The first, and these are all actions we can take in the present, but are acting on fields within this trajectory into the future. And the first field is like the near-term field of mitigation and adaptation, or what you might say a sort of superficial adaptation, the more kind of incremental, just sort of tweaking things and making ourselves more safe, and mitigation, trying to reduce carbon emissions as much as we possibly can. Because every fraction of a degree matters. It's not like, well, we're screwed, we might as well just do this, because and for those who are listening, I'm throwing my hands up in the air there, and giving up. What scientists say is that every fraction of a degree matters, and the hotter it gets, the more every fraction matters.
Right.
And so mitigation matters in every single pathway, and we shouldn't abandon it. So no talking about deep transformational resilience or the future beyond that is cannibalizing, the importance of mitigation. In fact, important ways these things all interact with each other. So that's the first one. That's where the vast majority of energy has been focused. Yeah. And if the inner dimension is included at all, it's generally within this mitigation frame, and a bit of adaptation in terms of mental health. Like how do we stop ourselves being, really mentally unwell because of this climate crisis? That's what I mean by superficial adaptation.
Yeah.
Then we have our second field of action, and this is where things get gnarly in many different ways. It could be international conflict, global superpower conflict. It could be initially the collapse of financial markets, supply chains. We're going to lose probably one of our bread baskets. We're already potentially reached kind of peak agricultural, and we're sort of going down in terms of yield and farmable land. as the population continues to grow, etc. So, like, there's going to be a pinch point, leading to political, instability, etc. What can we do now to prepare ourselves for that time, to preserve, to create sanctuary, preserve what we need, to have what was been described as transformational resilience, which is to say, to go through that time and to learn from it, and to get to the potentially another side of some big drop, in social order, with enough there that we can start to build back differently.
Yeah.
And so there's a great book come out recently called the Life House, which I'd recommend to people, which looks at the role of physical spaces and communities, and really it has a kind of like radical and left slant. But I think it has, whatever your political persuasion, there's a lot of value in this, thinking locally and thinking about the networks that you can create now, because community, social cohesion, different forms of connections, whether that's like the three sorts that the academic literature talk about, which is like bonding connections, bridging. Oh God, I've started another list without remembering all three of them. There's another one which means connecting different communities, not just, so it's like deep ties, weak ties, and ties between very different parts of society. And these are things that we can all invest in now. Like I'm doing a street party on my road next June, because street parties are fun, but also I want those connections to be there when things start to get a little bit tricky,
Yeah.
And then also we can invest that at a national level. And there are some conversations, interestingly, in the kind of national, in the UK in context, about community hubs around this kind of thing. Anyway, that's the second field of action. Third field of action. Now, this actually has more emphasis in the inner-outer transformation world than that middle one. And this is the kind of what happens when we're really ready to shift mindsets, when we're really shown how out of alignment with reality we've been living. And that's where things can be waiting, new ideas, new philosophies, new ways of organizing, new ways of convening democratically and sense making, etc., have been developed, since the 60s, but are getting more and more sophisticated and are ready in real ways to be trialed at a population level.
That's what you mean by islands of coherence.
Exactly. So there are islands of coherence that are developing, that there isn't appetite to back them, and they're too far outside of the Overton window, as you say, in political and policy landscapes. The window of conceivably backable policy ideas by mainstream parties, but they are increasingly tested and increasingly viable. And when the world gets different enough, there will be an appetite to genuinely shift towards some of these islands of coherence. And the other analogy, which is similar to that islands of coherence concept, is the imaginal cells of butterflies. That some cells, even in the caterpillar, think they're butterflies and are trying to be different, but the immune system of the caterpillar attacks them until there's a point at which that caterpillar's immune system can't keep back the tide anymore, and it kind of goes into a chrysalis and then butterfly fate. Wow. And so there are many thousands of people who are conversant in systems transformation, in interfacing with traditional power, but also understand the role of deep mindset shifts and spiritual shifts that are that go hand in hand with that have been piloting stuff, and so my work now moving forwards will be focusing on this resilience piece, because I feel like of those three fields, that's where this inner outer integration thing is least well considered. But yeah, if you have a local group that might be interested in resilience, I would really encourage you to look up the work of Bob Doppelt, who is starting an initiative in the US called the transformational. I'll have to look that up. He's developing a global program with the UN's Race to Resilience for local communities to think about resilience in their own.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time now, Jamie. But one question I always ask people before we finish is the middle way, as we understand it in the middle way societies, that if you avoid the the extremes, that throws you into the messy, uncertain middle. But it's arguably in that place that we can get to grips perhaps more adequately with the phenomena that we encounter. So, I mean, we've touched, you actually used the word yourself, the messy middle, earlier on. So, how would you best articulate your understanding of the middle way, especially with what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I think we're in an era of middle way solutions, or not. I mean, solutions doesn't quite cover it, does it? And I'm sure that's a lot of what your inquiry has been about over the years. Like for instance, there's a middle way between these two narratives I'm describing here, and there's a middle way between the certainties of modernism and the grand narratives of the 20th century, and where things are really real and truth can be known, and the kind of relativism and the unrealness of postmodernism. And I'm really, one of the things I'm most encouraged about actually is what is described sometimes as postmodernism. And metamodernism is one of the examples of that, philosophies, ideas that are coming through that help us to build on what is our best guess for how things are and how things should go, and start having a sense of kind of like the judgment that we need, and bringing in values and discernment, and not just abdicating to science as if it's a view from nowhere, because we've absorbed the critique of that from postmodernism. Not getting lost in that postmodern thing where anyone's view is equally valid or whatever.
Absolutely.
And when you adopt that postmodern sensibility, which is sort of on the rise with sort of the internet and our times of needing to response, needing to do something. For God's sake, like even if it's partial, we know it's probably wrong, but we need to start iterating, right? That middle way philosophy of postmodernism, metamodernism, whatever, I think opens up, and this needs a whole other podcast to explain why, but it opens up the possibility of holding different views, different ways of looking in superposition with each other, and to entertain perspectives without collapsing to one as being the truth, or that relativism of everyone having their own truth. If you see what I mean, and that the communities of thought and praxis that are developing around that particular philosophical, artistic, and political move give me hope, and are very aligned with what you've been doing. So there's a messy middle in the world out there, and there's a messy middle in the world in here. And one, I think, is making the other arise, and that thing that's arising, this movement that's arising, is making our ability to deal with the messy middle out there much greater, I think.
Brilliant. Just last question. If people wanted to find out more about your work, Jamie, how would they go about it?
Yeah, so I have a website which is jamiebristow.com. So all my main publications are on there. I will be spending much of the next year working particularly on resilience. So if you have work in this area, I'll be doing a sort of initially working with some other colleagues to scope this, particularly where inner psychological, cultural dimensions of societal resilience can be bolstered. Please do go to the website, get in touch, and And also, you know, a lot of my work is with the Climate Majority Project and the Inner Development Goals. So they have great websites with more stuff about this inner dimension of transformation.
Smashing. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today, Jamie. It actually has been really inspiring for me. Just thank you very much for giving up your time today.
Thank you, Barry. It's been really, really good to focus on this area. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.